What would you do if a wild animal looked into your eyes and asked for help? In the heart of Arizona's high desert, a lonely wildlife photographer stumbled upon a frail bobcat kitten, barely clinging to life. That single encounter sparked a journey of healing, trust, and an unbreakable bond between human and wild. But what happened over the next few months didn't just change their lives. It shook the hearts of millions across the world. This isn't just a rescue story. It's a story of survival, purpose, and the powerful connection that defies species. Stay with us. You won't believe how it ends. A quiet life in the Red Hills. Some people go looking for meaning in cities and crowds. Jenna found it in the silence of stone and sky. The sun had barely crested the copper ridges of Sedona when Jenna Ryland stepped barefoot onto her porch, a hot mug of black coffee steaming in her hands. The air was crisp, scented with creosote and juniper, and the red rock canyons glowed softly under the early light, like embers still burning from the night before. Jenna, 29 years old, stood alone, her lean frame wrapped in a faded green flannel, her auburn braid slung over one shoulder like a rope she'd climbed 100 times. Her skin bore freckles and the tan lines of someone who had long traded office ceilings for open skies. She wore no makeup, no jewelry, except for a tiny silver ring around her neck on a cord, the only piece of her brother she still carried. It had been 3 years since the accident, since everything in her life shifted from color to grayscale. Before that day, Jenna was already a photographer, wildlife mostly. Her portfolio was full of antelope shadows at dusk, owls in flight, desert foxes caught mid-pounce. But after the crash that took her younger brother Mason, something in her shutter slowed. She no longer clicked for art. She hunted for silence. And that's how she ended up here. Her small adobe cabin sat on the fringe of the Coconino National Forest, about 45 minutes outside Sedona's tourist heartbeat. Out here, the only traffic was javelinas cutting across dry creek beds, and the occasional bobcat slinking past her motion cameras in the night. She had chosen isolation like a second skin. No neighbors for miles. No distractions. Just the wind whispering through sagebrush and the crunch of her boots on sand. Her days followed a rhythm as precise as any military drill. Up at 5. Coffee by sunrise. Gear packed. Hikes planned. She followed animal tracks like clues in a diary she couldn't put down. And when she wasn't shooting, she was editing in the dim glow of her cabin, the hum of her old desktop filling the silence Mason once did. But even in the stillness, something inside Jenna fidgeted. She never talked about him, not to the ranger who stopped by once a month with water reports, not to her editor in Flagstaff, and definitely not to her few remaining friends back east who still messaged now and then. "You need to come back. You don't have to grieve alone." But Jenna didn't reply. The desert, in its brutal honesty, had become her confession booth. And yet, that morning, something tugged at her. A restlessness in her bones. A whisper that today wouldn't be like the others. She glanced at the old Nikon resting on the entryway table, then at the weathered hiking boots by the door. Something inside her shifted. Grabbing her backpack, she slung the camera strap around her neck and opened the door to the trail behind her house, the one that led deeper into the red wilderness, the one she only took when she wanted to get lost. As she walked, the morning sun warmed the canyon walls. Lizards darted across sandstone. Ravens called from above like omens, and Jenna, camera in hand, followed a path she didn't fully remember choosing. She had no idea that by the end of the day, her world would be turned upside down by a creature no bigger than a loaf of bread, and that something small, wild, and broken was about to stitch her soul back together. A voice in the dust. Sometimes the wilderness doesn't whisper, it cries out, and if you're lucky, you hear it in time. Jenna moved through the canyon trail with steady, instinctive steps. The ground beneath her boots shifted from fine red dust to scattered gravel as she descended toward a dry wash. Mesquite trees leaned over the trail like silent watchers, their twisted limbs casting spidery shadows. Overhead, a hawk traced lazy circles across a pale blue sky. She didn't have a destination, just a feeling. It had been an unusually warm February morning, and the trail felt different, like the air held a story waiting to be found. Jenna stopped occasionally to snap photos, an ant trail leading to a cactus bloom, a vulture preening on a snag, a set of mule deer tracks still fresh in the dust. But then she heard it. At first it was faint, a high-pitched sound that barely rose above the desert's natural hum. A whimper? No, more like a keening cry. Reedy. Ragged. Not bird, not wind. It didn't belong here. Jenna froze, cocking her head toward the direction of the sound. It came again, closer now. Her heart beat faster, not with fear, but with the quiet electric tension she always felt just before capturing something rare. She followed it. The sound led her off the marked path, through a cluster of agave and cola cactus. She ducked beneath a low branch, thorns snagging her sleeve, then scrambled down a slope lined with crumbling rock. At the base was a tangle of prickly pear and faded grass, and then movement. A twitch of fur. Jenna dropped to one knee, eyes scanning, camera forgotten at her side. There, half hidden beneath a bush, was a tiny creature. It was curled into itself, no bigger than a football. Its fur was dull, mottled with dust, the faintest pattern of spots along its back. Ears too large for its head trembled at every sound, and its eyes, bright, glassy, wild, locked with hers. A bobcat kitten. Jenna's breath caught in her throat. She knew enough to recognize the signs. This wasn't a newborn, but it was young, maybe 4 or 5 weeks old at most. Too young to be alone. Its ribs were visible beneath the short russet fur. Its right foreleg dragged limply as it shifted in the dirt. One paw was raw, swollen, and it was crying, not out of fear but desperation. Her hand instinctively went to her pack. Water. Granola bar. Bandana. She stopped. This was a wild animal. Intervening without proper wildlife permits could be illegal, even harmful. And yet, she saw something in the kitten's eyes. Something that overrode rules and reason. Panic. Pain. Abandonment. Jenna crouched low, slow as still water. She didn't speak, just extended her hand, palm open, letting the wind carry her scent. The kitten flinched, then stayed. It didn't bolt. It didn't growl. It just watched, breathing shallowly, one paw trembling. Jenna scanned the area. No sign of a den, no tracks that might suggest a mother nearby. And the smell, the faint sourness of infection lingered in the air. This kitten had been alone for too long. Her pulse quickened as instinct battled hesitation. This was the kind of decision you didn't take back. If she took it home, even temporarily, it would change everything. She'd be responsible. She could be reported. And yet she didn't move away. She slipped the bandana from her neck and gently reached forward. The kitten didn't hiss. It didn't fight. It simply allowed her to wrap it, its tiny claws clinging to the fabric like it was the first warmth it had felt in days. As she cradled it to her chest, Jenna whispered, more to herself than to the animal, "I got you." And for the first time in 3 years, she felt something open inside her. Not just pity, not just obligation, hope. Rescue isn't always legal. Sometimes the rules don't matter. Sometimes doing the right thing means breaking them. Jenna held the bundle of fur against her chest as she retraced her steps back up the canyon slope. The kitten barely moved, its body limp except for the occasional twitch of its tail. Each step felt heavier than the last, not because of the weight in her arms, but the one settling in her mind. This wasn't what she planned when she left the house that morning. She was trained to observe wildlife, not interfere. As a licensed photographer working closely with state rangers, she knew the boundaries. Arizona laws were clear. Rescuing a wild animal without a permit, even with good intentions, was considered illegal possession. And bobcats, protected as they were, came with an extra layer of scrutiny. But what was she supposed to do? Leave it? Jenna had seen death in nature plenty of times. She'd documented starving coyotes, injured hawks with shattered wings, even a rattlesnake writhing after being clipped by an ATV. She had trained herself not to step in, just record, report, and move on. But this was different. This kitten wasn't a distant subject in her lens. It had cried for her, looked into her eyes like it was asking for help, and worse, trusted her. By the time she reached the trailhead, her breath was shallow, and her arms were wrapped tighter around the kitten. She looked down. Its eyes were closed now, breathing shallow but steady. The bandana around it was damp from its own warmth and fear. "Hang in there," she muttered, quickening her pace. Her truck sat baking in the sun at the trail's edge. She climbed in, turned the AC on full blast, and reached for her emergency hiking kit behind the seat. She pulled out a small water bottle, twisted off the cap, and dabbed her fingers to moisten the kitten's mouth. It responded weakly, tongue flicking once. Jenna's hands shook. What now? She couldn't exactly show up at the nearest ranger station with a bobcat in her arms. And the closest wildlife rehab center was over an hour away, if they'd even accept an unlicensed intake without reporting her. The risk was real. Fines, possible revocation of her press access to protected lands, maybe even charges. But the kitten didn't care about that. It just needed help. So she made the decision that would change everything. She turned the key and drove straight home. The dirt road to her adobe cabin felt longer than usual. Each pothole jostled the kitten. Each turn brought another knot to her stomach. When she finally reached the driveway, she parked in the shade and slipped inside, drawing the curtains and locking the door behind her. The moment her boots hit the tile floor, a new kind of silence filled the space. Not the peaceful, chosen quiet she was used to, but the heavy, charged stillness of knowing she'd just crossed a line. She laid the kitten on a soft towel in a cardboard box and set it near the fireplace, even though it was 78 degrees outside. Then she pulled out her phone. Her finger hovered over the contact list: animal control, state park services, veterinary clinics. She scrolled past them all and opened a search instead. Emergency care for orphaned bobcat kittens. An article popped up from a wildlife rehabilitation center in Flagstaff. It described feeding schedules, body temperature monitoring, isolation methods, and imprinting risk. Imprinting. If the kitten bonded too closely with a human, it might never be releasable into the wild. That was the last thing Jenna wanted. But what other option did she have? She reached down and stroked the kitten's head gently with one finger. Its ear twitched. A faint sigh escaped its tiny lungs. "I'm not going to keep you," she whispered. "I'm just going to help you survive." And yet, deep down, part of her knew. Some lines, once crossed, don't lead back to where you started. The silent roommate. Some bonds don't begin with words. They begin with a glance, a breath, a heartbeat shared in silence. The first night was fragile. Jenna barely slept. She kept the box near her bed, watching the small rise and fall of the kitten's chest like a mother terrified of missing a single breath. Every few hours she reached over to check the warmth of the towel, adding microwaved rice socks for heat. The desert cooled quickly after sundown, and despite the late winter season, temperatures inside her adobe home dipped into the low 60s overnight. By morning, she felt more like a nurse than a photographer. The kitten, Maple she'd started calling her, was alive but weak. She hadn't moved much except to twitch her back leg occasionally. Jenna prepared a shallow dish of kitten formula made from goat milk, following the instructions she'd found online. When she offered it, Maple turned her head disinterested, too weak or too frightened to try. Jenna tried again with a syringe. This time, success. A few tentative sips, no more than half an ounce, but enough to reassure Jenna that Maple hadn't given up completely. Over the next few days, a pattern emerged. Quiet hours, slow progress. Jenna canceled a planned backcountry shoot and turned her kitchen into a makeshift wildlife nursery. Every feeding was an act of patience. Every movement near the kitten was slow, steady, deliberate. She never spoke above a whisper. Her phone buzzed on the third day, a missed call from the Flagstaff photo editor. She didn't call back. Instead, she sat cross-legged on the floor, watching Maple as the kitten began to stir more often. Her eyes, still glassy and unsure, tracked Jenna's movements now. When Jenna entered the room, Maple would lift her head, just a little, but enough to show recognition. That quiet acknowledgement made something flicker inside Jenna, a light she hadn't felt in a long time. In the evenings, she'd edit photos with Maple curled nearby in her towel bed, the soft click of her mouse and keys filling the room. The kitten didn't meow, didn't purr. Bobcats, she learned, rarely vocalized at that age. But sometimes Jenna could hear her breathing, slow, steady, and it gave her something she hadn't had in years, a rhythm. On the 6th day, Maple tried to stand on her own. It was clumsy, painful to watch, one paw dragging awkwardly, but she did it. She stood, wobbled, and looked up at Jenna as if to say, "Look, I'm still here." Jenna clapped quietly, a smile breaking across her face. "That's it, girl. That's it." Later that night, as she wrote in her journal, she realized she hadn't written anything personal in months. Her last entry had been half a sentence, a failed attempt to reflect on Mason's birthday. But now she had lines, pages, notes about formula timing, Maple's progress, and how wild animals can still choose trust when it matters most. and she wrote something she hadn't expected. She doesn't feel like a project. She feels like a roommate. A very quiet, mysterious, clawed roommate. Jenna placed the journal on the shelf beside her bed, the same one where Mason's sketch pad still sat, untouched, and looked over at the small creature breathing softly in her towel nest. She didn't know what this would become, whether Maple would survive another week or be strong enough to return to the wild. But she knew this. In her cabin, where only ghosts had kept her company for 3 long years. Now, there was life, and it had pause, a heart caught in 2 worlds. She was born to be wild, but in the quiet between moments, she chose to stay. By the end of the 2nd week, Maple had transformed. The limp in her front leg had faded to a subtle hitch. She now climbed onto low furniture with surprising stealth, her muscles strengthening day by day. Her coat had deepened in color, no longer a dusty, patchy mess, but a sleek mixture of warm russet and soft gray, with dusky black rosettes along her shoulders and back. The tufts of her ears began to rise like exclamation points. She was beautiful, and she was getting harder to ignore. Jenna had stopped thinking of her as a temporary guest. Not because she wanted to keep her, not really, but because Maple no longer felt like a thing to manage. She was a presence, a mood in the room, a flicker of motion by the window at dusk. She moved like wind when she wanted to be unseen, and like thunder when she wanted to play. But the wildness, it never left. Jenna noticed it in small things. The way Maple stared out the window at night, her ears twitching at every far-off howl. The way she crouched low and watched birds through the screen with a predator's focus. She no longer curled up in the towel bed Jenna had made her. She slept now in high places, on shelves, atop the fireplace mantel, behind Jenna's old record player. There were moments of affection, but never surrender. Jenna would sit near her on the floor, offering her hand. Sometimes Maple would press her head against it. Other times, she'd swat it away gently, not to hurt, just to remind, "I'm not yours." And Jenna respected that. Still, a part of her hoped that the bond would grow stronger. That Maple might one day come when called, or curl in her lap the way cats do in stories. But every time she thought they were close, Maple would dart off to a corner and disappear for hours. One afternoon, after a feeding, Maple suddenly leapt up and knocked a ceramic mug from the counter. It shattered on the floor. Jenna didn't scold her. Instead, she watched Maple freeze at the sound, crouch low, tail twitching, not afraid of being punished, but startled by the chaos she'd created. Jenna knelt beside her. "You're not broken," she whispered. "You're just wild." That night, she sat on the porch with a notebook in her lap and a flashlight balanced on her knee. Maple paced behind the screen door, restless, watching the darkness. Jenna wrote, "She doesn't need me to love her like a pet. She needs me to love her like the wind, free but always returning." Still, the reality began to close in. Jenna knew she couldn't keep Maple. Not forever. And the longer the kitten stayed, the greater the risk she'd grow too attached to human life. If Maple lost her fear of people, she'd never survive out there. Worse, she might try to approach the wrong person and end up hurt or euthanized. The rehab articles were clear. There's a window. A critical stretch of time where wild instincts can still be preserved. And it was closing. Jenna made the call the next morning. A quiet wildlife rehab center near Flagstaff, one she trusted to keep things off the books. They agreed to take Maple, but only if Jenna could prove she hadn't imprinted her. That word again. Imprinted. Like a tattoo on the soul. Could she say honestly that Maple hadn't? Jenna looked at the shelf, where Maple now sat like a statue, eyes half-lidded, tail curled around her feet. She was watching her, not waiting for affection, but simply aware. Connected. They were bonded, yes, but wild remained wild. At least for now. Is she ready, or am I? The hardest part of love isn't giving. It's releasing, knowing it might never return. Jenna stood at the edge of the transitional enclosure, a wide expanse of fenced wildland that bordered the open desert. The land was raw, untouched, an in-between space provided by a local wildlife rehab program for animals preparing to return to the wild. It wasn't a cage. Not exactly. But it wasn't freedom either. Just a waiting room for release. Maple clung to her shoulder like a ghost of her younger self, but the bobcat was bigger now, stronger. At nearly 12 weeks, she'd gained weight, muscle, confidence. Her eyes, once soft with need, now burned with focus. Her movements were fluid, unpredictable. Less kitten, more shadow. Less touch. Instead, she buried frozen quail and left scent trails, taught her to stalk and wait and leap. It was the hardest unloving Jenna had ever done, this stepping backward, this fading. But Maple adapted faster than she expected. On day 3, she caught a mouse. On day 5, she hissed when Jenna approached. By day 7, she didn't look back when Jenna left, and that hurt more than Jenna was ready to admit. She sat on a sun-warmed boulder near the fence line and pulled out her journal. "She's becoming what she was meant to be," she wrote, "and I don't know if I'll ever see her again." A hawk cried overhead, the only sound in the wide, open stillness. She thought of Mason, her brother, and how she'd never gotten a goodbye from him. How one moment he was there, bright, loud, full of life, and the next, silence. Maybe this time she'd get to say goodbye the right way. That night, back at the cabin, she didn't light a fire. She sat in the quiet, the kind that once crushed her, now just held her gently. On the windowsill lay a single paw print, dried mud from Maple's morning visit, a final smudge of presence. Jenna didn't wipe it away. She placed her palm beside it, matching their shapes. For the first time since her brother's death, the silence didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a beginning. One morning, she was gone. You think you're prepared for the goodbye? Until it doesn't say goodbye at all. It was the 8th morning of the release process when Jenna arrived to find the enclosure empty. No paw prints by the gate, no rustle of grass, no sound. Just the soft hush of wind brushing through the mesquite and the red sun lifting slowly over the canyon rim. She called once. Not loudly, just enough. Maple. Nothing. She waited, her thermos of coffee cooling in her hands. Sometimes Maple would take her time coming down from the ridge. She liked to perch on the high rocks and watch birds trace patterns across the desert sky. She was always quiet about it, always wild, even when she still returned. But that morning she didn't come back. Jenna walked the perimeter, scanning the stones for tracks, claw marks, anything. There were signs, vague ones. A small trail leading under the wire, a few tufts of fur caught on a creosote branch. No signs of a struggle. No blood, just absence. She knelt by the spot where Maple had buried her last meal the day before. The ground was untouched. The feathers of a half-eaten quail still rested in the dirt. It was like she had vanished without a sound, without a warning, without a goodbye. Jenna didn't cry, not right away. Instead, she sat on the flat rock near the gate, elbows resting on her knees, hands clasped like in prayer. The wind picked up, dry and cool, brushing against her face and tugging at her braid. She whispered to the stillness, "So that's it, huh?" And for a moment, she imagined Maple somewhere out there, slipping between the piñon trees, crouching low beneath a fallen log, ears high, eyes alert, finally home in a way Jenna could never give her. But the ache still settled in her chest, deep and slow. This wasn't like losing Mason. Mason had been taken. Maple had chosen to leave, and somehow that made it worse. She returned to the cabin that afternoon, her truck rumbling down the long dirt road that had once felt like an escape. Now it felt longer, quieter, like she was driving away from something precious she might never touch again. Inside, the house looked too still. The towel bed beside the hearth sat unused. A feathered toy lay untouched on the windowsill. Her boots left dry prints on the tile as she walked past the couch where Maple had once perched, staring out at the coyotes howling in the distance. She sank into her chair by the fireless hearth and closed her eyes. In her journal that night she wrote, "This is what freedom looks like, silent, final, and right." She didn't light a candle, didn't pour a drink. She just sat with the quiet, letting it wrap around her like a memory she didn't want to forget. In the days that followed, she returned to the enclosure twice, just in case, just to check. But the signs faded. No paw prints, no fur, no eyes glowing in the brush at dusk. It was over. On the 10th day, she stopped going. Instead, she walked a new trail, one Mason had once explored with her, back before life changed. She took her camera again for the first time in weeks, letting the lens refocus her world. She didn't look for Maple anymore. But sometimes, when the wind shifted or the trees stood especially still, she swore she could feel eyes on her from far away, not watching, just remembering. A kitten who touched the world. Sometimes the smallest life leaves the biggest mark, not just on one heart, but on thousands. Jenna didn't plan to share Maple's story. It felt too private, too delicate, like a secret the desert had whispered just for her. But as the weeks passed, she found herself scrolling through the hundreds of photos she'd taken during those quiet, extraordinary months. There were images of Maple stretching in the morning light, her spotted coat catching the glow. Maple curled up beside a pile of pine cones. Maple halfway up the window screen, eyes wide with mischief. Each one was a fragment of something sacred. And one night, without quite knowing why, Jenna uploaded them to her blog. She didn't write much, just a quiet post titled "The Wild Thing That Healed Me." It began with a sentence she hadn't rehearsed, but which came straight from her chest. I once believed healing only came through people, but it came on 4 paws, with silence and teeth, and the desert's breath between us. She included a dozen photos. One of the first day, one from the day Maple climbed her first tree, one taken the morning before she disappeared. Maple silhouetted on a ridge, tail raised, face turned toward the horizon like she'd already made her decision. Jenna closed the laptop, made tea, and went to bed. By sunrise, everything had changed. Her email inbox had flooded overnight. Hundreds of messages, then thousands. People from all over the country, and soon from around the world, were writing in. Wildlife lovers, grieving siblings, lonely souls stuck in cities, children who begged their parents to read the story again, teachers who wanted to share it in classrooms, therapists who said they were using it in trauma workshops. This made me cry in the best way. My son and I read it together, and now he wants to be a wildlife vet. I lost my brother too. Thank you for giving me a way to feel close to him again. Jenna sat at her desk in stunned silence. She hadn't realized how deeply Maple's quiet story would resonate, or how badly the world needed a reminder that healing doesn't always roar. It sometimes arrives as a whisper, curled and wounded, asking only to be seen. Within a month, a small publishing house reached out. They wanted to create a children's book based on Maple's journey. Jenna hesitated at first, unsure whether turning something so intimate into a product felt right. But then she thought of all the kids who might learn, for the first time, that wild things are worth protecting, that letting go is a kind of love, that strength can look like trust. She said yes. The book, Maple of the Red Hills, was released 6 months later with hand-drawn illustrations based on Jenna's photographs. It became an unexpected hit in schools and libraries. Her inbox filled again, this time with drawings from children, letters to Miss Jenna, and wild animal stories of their own. She started visiting classrooms, not often, just when the stillness at the cabin felt too heavy. She spoke softly, never with a script, and always ended with the same photo. Maple, poised on that ledge, halfway between shadow and sunrise. She didn't talk about Mason unless asked, but when she did, it wasn't with pain anymore. It was with peace. And every time a hand rose in the crowd asking if Maple ever came back, Jenna would smile and say, no, but she never really left either. Because in every heart she had touched, through pixels, pages, or paw prints, Maple still ran wild. The paw prints in the dust? Not all goodbyes are forever. Some just lead to quieter hellos. A year had passed since Maple vanished into the wild. Jenna hadn't returned to the transitional enclosure since her last visit. But on the anniversary of Maple's departure, something pulled at her, an old thread woven through memory and instinct. She packed light, water, notebook, her Nikon, and a single eagle feather. It had once belonged to Mason. He'd found it during a camping trip when they were kids, called it the kind of luck you don't ask for twice. She'd kept it hidden in her journal ever since. That morning, Jenna hiked alone. The desert felt familiar but different, like a chapter she'd already read but hadn't fully understood. Birds darted through the brush. Coyotes called in the distance. Her boots crunched softly against the red dust, each step echoing something deeper. When she reached the ridge, she paused. The wind was quiet, the canyon wide open. A stillness hung in the air, not emptiness but possibility. Then she saw it. A small cluster of fresh prints in the dust, bigger than a house cat's, smaller than a cougar's. Just a few, scattered near a juniper tree. The edges were clean, unweathered. A few tufts of fur clung to the bark. Jenna knelt, her breath caught halfway in her chest. Bobcat. She looked around slowly, scanning the ledges, the rocks, the shadows. Nothing moved, but she smiled anyway. She reached into her pack, pulled out the eagle feather, and nestled it gently between 2 stones at the base of the tree. A gift. A thank you. Or maybe just a memory, placed where the wild could find it. As she stood, the wind picked up again, brushing her braid across her face. Behind her, a raven croaked from a distant perch. She didn't need proof. She knew. Somewhere out there, Maple was alive. Older now, stronger, still wild. And watching. Not waiting. Not coming back. Just watching. Jenna turned back toward the trail, the morning sun warm on her shoulders. She didn't look over her shoulder. She didn't need to, because some goodbyes aren't endings. They're just another way of saying, I remember you too. She was never mine, but she was meant to find me. Some souls don't stay in our lives forever. They just pass through long enough to leave us whole again. Back at the cabin, Jenna placed a new photo on the mantel. Not of Maple, but of the canyon ridge, just as she left it. Empty. Beautiful. Alive. She no longer needed the image of Maple to feel her presence. The memory lived in the rhythm of the wind, the rustle of dry leaves, the soft prints outside her window after a rain, and in the quiet parts of herself that had once been broken. Maple had never been a pet. She was never tamed, never owned. She had been something more. A mirror, a moment. A wild kind of love that came when Jenna was too tired to ask for help, and stayed long enough to show her how to breathe again. Jenna still took photos. She still walked alone. But now, when the silence pressed in, it didn't feel like a void. It felt like space, room for healing, room for memory, room for whatever wild thing might find her next. Because love doesn't always come with leashes or words. Sometimes it has claws, and sometimes it simply walks beside you until it's ready to disappear, but never really leaves. Healing doesn't always come from people. It sometimes comes from something wild, unexpected, and beautifully untamed. Maple's story isn't just about a bobcat. It's about the parts of ourselves we hide, and the quiet ways the universe nudges us to open again. Her journey with Jenna reminds us that connection doesn't always come wrapped in conversation or comfort. Sometimes it's found in trust earned over silence, in small gestures, in simply being present for another soul, human or not. Letting go, too, is its own kind of love. In a